right. Well, hello, everybody. This is Michael Sishan, Chief Marketing Officer of One Cosmos. I'm here today with Huzefa Olia, our Chief Operating Officer, to talk about multi-factor authentication. How are you today, Huzefa?
I am good, Michael, but I don't look as sharp as you.
Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate that. So there's been so much talk about multi-factor authentication. Can you
Hmm.
just introduce the topic a little bit and talk about why has this risen to everybody's top of mind right now?
I think one of there are multiple different reasons, but I would say one significant one has been recently, in fact, last year, Biden administration coming out with a mandate with respect to what they need, what government agencies, organizations need to do with respect to multi-factor authentication. With the environment that we are living in today, with the threats everywhere around the world, with hacker presence being there almost around us, the government agencies are can only play whack-a-mole when it comes to any kind of a cyber threat, right? Only to a certain extent. So multi-factor authentication, if you look at it, is an evolution of how we are, managing access today in any kind of a system or a service.
Okay.
Right? Instead of entering just your username or a password, I need to challenge you to make sure that you are the person who is behind the username or a password.
Okay. So I'm familiar with that directive. They talked about multi-factor authentication. They talked about zero trust. So setting aside the zero trust, let's just level set on what is MFA. And you just mentioned you use it in conjunction with passwords. Why do you need it?
What great question. Right? So multi-factor authentication is essentially built on three key principles. It's built on the principle of what you have, just like a device that has been issued to you by an organization that has been tied to you. Second is something that you know, which is a password or a PIN that you have registered yourself with. And then the third aspect is what you are or who you are, right? And that's where elements like a fingerprint or a biometrics come into the picture as well. So multi-factor authentication essentially means that anyone who needs to authenticate now into a system, yes, they have to prove essentially provide a username or a password, but in addition to that, have to use any two of these different factors, right? Either what they have as well as what they know or what they are.
Okay, so over and above the password, which we know can be hacked, lost, stolen, what have you, we have these additional factors: the what you know, what you are, what you have. Um, what's the problem? I mean, what does it work? Does it not work? What are the issues?
So let's go back to what I just said. Right. The first one, which most organizations work with, is what you know, and that's where significantly lies the problem. Right. The problem lies with a username or a password that has been issued to you and a PIN as well. And we all know that passwords are hackable, right? Either when it comes to any kind of social engineering that is goes behind with it, or even when it comes to the data of a password or a pin being stored in any kind of a system. So traditional multi-factor system have operated with a pretext of what you know and then what you have into the equation, right? And if you are trying to put a band-aid on a problem, which is passwords, by adding essentially using that as part of your band-aid, right? Then that's not an effective solution.
Okay, so the person knows the password. They have a second factor, I guess, which is the code. That pretty much proves their identity, doesn't it?
Not necessarily, right? Like I said earlier, right? Like a password can be compromised, and there are multiple different instances of how a password can be compromised along with the PIN. There are cases of social engineering. More recent hacks have happened with respect to that. You have a password or a PIN that can be compromised based on the device um, or the communication channel that is being used to essentially communicate that to the user. And most effectively, at the end of the day, when we talk about identity and access management, it is important to essentially assert a user's identity. In everything that I described to you right now, there is no identity in the equation. It's essentially just a password or a PIN that is being provided to you on a device, nothing tying back to
Got
what
it.
a user's identity is.
Okay, so these do not prove identity, but they come pretty close to, maybe this is probably the person that it's supposed to be. So how are we solving this problem, the identity gap, if you will, in MFA?
Yeah, let's not move far away from MFA, right? The only when we talk about multi-factor solutions and to do it right, you still start with providing a user a device or user knowing or having a device that they trust. But in addition to that, prove who the user is, right? So essentially, using the biometrics into the equation becomes a very effective multi-factor solution. Right? In addition to that, you need to make sure that the device is trusted. That's where zero trust comes in. We can talk a little bit more about that as well. But if you change the way a user needs to authenticate, right, and the change can be more with respect to I want to prove who I am, and I want to prove it with a device that is secure, is being assigned to me. And when I'm challenged to prove who I am, I'm going to essentially prove myself by using my biometrics instead of giving you a password or a PIN.
Okay, so the device, the handset, or the I guess the laptop device, that becomes the what you have, correct?
Exactly.
It's
Correct.
the this gets back to the secure enclave or this TPM chip, correct?
Yeah. So let me plug our solution right now. It's a shameless plug. So the way we do this is we, anytime that a user is enrolled, we create a private key that is stored cryptographically on a secure enclave of the user's device.
Got
Right. So that makes it in a very, very secure place. Right. In addition to that, right, we make sure that we use a user's biometrics. Right.
it.
Those
Okay.
come in two different flavors, right? And I'm going to reveal the big surprise over here, which is either you use a device's biometrics, like the Face ID, Touch ID, or something proprietary that we have, which is called Live ID. Right? So you have the secure information stored in the TPM, right? And even to unlock that, right, you're using the user's biometrics to effectively use that specific key as well.
Okay, so the device biometrics, I mean, we're all familiar with this. You look at your Apple device, for example, and you log in. Um, that's pretty close to identity, right?
Very close, right? But not quite there, right? I would say that when it comes to most of the scenarios, most of the situations, yes, you can essentially prove with your Face ID or Touch ID. But most often, what happens is, you have your Face ID and Touch ID, multiple Face IDs and Touch IDs enrolled on a specific device, as well as if your device is compromised, right, and or if your touch id or face id is compromised, you are effectively not knowing who the user is behind that authentication that is happening. And that was one of the primary reasons of us introducing the concept of live biometrics.
Okay.
And the idea of a live biometrics is when you're challenging a user, and especially if you're looking at an authentication scenario of any kind of a sensitive system or a sensitive transaction, I do want to introduce that friction of the user having to prove who they are. Right? And what a live biometrics essentially does is challenges the user to prove their liveness. Right? It essentially asks the user to do some kind of a random action. So I know it's not just a Face ID or a Touch ID, right? But it is that user who has enrolled, onto the device as well as onto my system as well. I hope
Okay.
that answered the question.
It does kind of, but you've kind of raised a separate issue, which is the facial biometrics. I know there's been some discussion of uh, what's called decisioning bias or racial bias in this facial recognition. Is that then a new problem that surfaces?
Law, yeah, absolutely, right. Because when you walk into the world of biometrics, there are multiple different factors, right? One is security aspect of it, and the second is more with respect to the usability of it. what you described, comes into the second bucket. Let me just describe the first part on the security as well, because that's important too. Because if you're talking about passwords and passwords being replaced by biometrics, you want to make sure that that is effectively stored as well. So the way we do this is we've often seen that any kind of security loophole starts with how data is stored and managed, and most often that comes back to a database in the equation where all of this goes into one large big honeypot, right, and which is there for any kind of an attacker to compromise. The way we manage the biometrics is essentially the private key, which I was referring to earlier in the TPM, that is used to encrypt that data, shard it, and store it on a private blockchain. Right. So think of this: that your face, right, is becomes a face map, right, and that is then stored onto a blockchain. Right. So security is important, right, and we look at that and we manage that very effectively. The
Okay.
second aspect of it is the usability. This is where your false rejection rates, the bias when it comes to a user logging in becomes extremely important, right? So we have gone through extensive testing on our end, right, with leading biometrics firms to make sure that we are keeping all of those factors down into our system as well, right? We can we have a lot of different white papers as well as studies that we have created, which has effectively proven that when it comes to people logging in into a system, whether that being as an example, Michael, if you're logging in, I want to make sure that you're the right user you are getting in, right? Not getting locked out,
Well, I
right?
tell you, as a consumer, I'd like you to be sure it's me, because if you're talking about payroll data, if you're talking about our hard-won savings, obviously passwords aren't enough. These SMS codes aren't enough. The device biometrics scare me, so make it as strong as you can, please.
Absolutely. Right. And that's where I think when you talk about biometrics and live biometrics, et cetera, right, a lot of companies uh, tend to tighten the whole, right? But usability then takes a back seat, right? When comes to the factor that I want to make sure that you're the right user, I want to let you in, and I'm not discriminating against you as
Right.
well.
So the executive order also mentions zero trust, mentions multi-factor authentication and zero trust. What do these? Can you talk about zero trust and what these two have to do with each other?
Great, right? So zero trust, again, we won't have the time to unpack everything which goes in within that. But one of the pillars of zero trust is identity, right? And essentially, if you boil it down, I need to prove who I am every time I log in, right, into any kind of a system or a service, right? So when you look at zero trust today, or how organizations traditionally have been trying to implement zero trust, right, they have effectively used the traditional MFA method to challenge the user and ask the user to prove their identity, right? And we just unpacked that traditional MFA is not enough, right? So we believe that when it comes to zero trust, identity being the pillar, the user's identity has to be proven every time that they're being challenged to authenticate into a system. Right? That's where our version of what we describe as zero trust is using your live biometrics. So think about it. You have an employee who's logging in through remote access. I want to challenge and essentially say that Michael, if you're an employee coming in, I'm going to challenge you with my live biometrics. For you before you come in into any kind of my infrastructure, right? Or before you log into a Windows machine or a Mac operating system, so on and so forth.
So I get that. So zero trust would look at assumed trust as a risk, and that's somewhat obvious, I guess. But why hasn't this been done all along?
Same problem, right? That most of the organizations have traditionally used what the existing methods which are out there to implement zero trust, right? And that existing method comes to going back to the earlier point of what you know and what you have,
Got
right?
it. Got it. And it probably they drive users crazy if they ask them to key in an SMS code every time they request
Can
access.
you imagine the friction that you're introducing at that point, right? You're implementing zero trust, and you're telling the user it's not just username or password, but you have to enter a six-digit code, right? And hold on, wait a minute, I'm going to send you that six-digit code onto your phone,
Right.
right? So not only it's the security aspect of it, which is extremely important, right? But you want to reduce the user friction as well. But thank you very much, Michael. It was always a pleasure to be here with you. Right, great chatting, catching up around MFA Zero Trust. Right, look forward to connecting again.
It was really great having you.